Corey Ackley here, Hammer Steel Performance. So as we talked about in the other video that we did on the exhaust, that I will be doing a comparison between a 100 cubic inch, a 106 and a 116, 117, a big bore comparison. So with that said, I'll talk a little bit about each build. We'll sort of talk about what's the same, what's different, and then we'll get into it. Again, just a little comparison. I thought it would be fun to do. And I also have included a comparison on my bike with other Andrews V472s to sort of get a feel for how my bike makes more power than a standard Victory with the Andrews 472 cams in it. And again, in other videos I've talked about the Andrews are they may be a bolt-in camshaft, but there's a lot of considerations when you talk about valve spring installed height and some other things to make sure that you don't end up breaking valve springs. So with that said, we're going to move right into it. All right, thanks. Okay, here's the three builds we have. We have a 100 cubic inch build, we have a 106 build, and we have a 116, 117 big bore build. And we'll talk about each of the builds are up there. You can see what's been done to the bikes. I'll let you read that. But the bottom line, to distill it down, is these bikes all have a good 2-to-1 exhaust. And in fact, on the 106 and the 116, 117, they have the same Bassani road ridge exhaust. They also have the same or very similar baffle design going on there. They are all three builds are all running a camshaft that is very, very similar. And that is the Andrews 472 cams and the S&S 495 cams, which if you look at the cam spec, you understand cam specs, what you'll see is that they are really close. Again, as I said before, the S&S has a couple degrees more duration on the intake in the exhaust, and it has 20 thousandths lift more, but it is really close. There are some differences. So the difference between my 106 and the big bore that we tested here, both are on cross countries or magnums in cross countries, is obviously the big bore has higher compression, about 10.5 to 1 compression, and mine stock head, stock compression. I do have a larger throttle body, which we talked about before, that they don't really, it doesn't really make much of a difference on power. So this is really on the 106 versus the 116. They're really almost identical builds minus the big bore kit and the associated compression that goes along with that. Now the 100, a little bit different. The 100 has about 10 to 1 compression in there. It has a 48 millimeter throttle body as well, which again, everyone will say doesn't make a difference. It doesn't really make a difference, but it's on there. And then I also did some bowl work and some light porting on the heads to help flow a little bit more. But what you'll see here are, again, three builds that are very close when you look at most of the hard parts. In this graph, what we've done here is I've overlaid 2-3 cross countries with the V472 cams. All these bikes, valve spring installed heights were checked to make sure that we could run the 472 cams with stock springs. So with that being said, this is sort of what you see. I can't remember all the exhausts. I don't have them in my notes, except for on V472A, those are triovals. And you can tell by the rock solid straight torque curve in there. And so with that being said, you see all the other bikes are pretty grouped together. 472A has a little bit more horsepower than the other two do, but they're all sort of sitting in that 113, 114 horsepower range. And then torque is sitting there, you know, in the ball, 116, 117 foot-pounds of torque, somewhere in that window. And then you see mine up above that, and that is the exhaust baffle design. I'm running a 2-in-1 with a modified baffle. The other bikes are all running the factory cross-country 212 with some type of slip-on on there. So as you can see, my bike makes, torque-wise, makes more torque than the other bikes do. With that being said, if these other bikes had their RPM limiter extended beyond, 6,000, you'd probably see at least bike A would probably have the same, maybe not a little bit more horsepower than mine has. All right, so there's just a little comparison between the 472s. They're not a magic cam. I've done a lot of work on my bike to, again, like I said the other day, to extract as much as I can out of it. And so that's why you see mine making a little more power than you would normally see on just an average cam swap on a cross country, utilizing the 472 cams with understanding the caveats that we've talked about before. All right, thank you. So when you take 3 different displacements and you build them all similarly, whoa, I jacked that up. But anyways, you get what I'm saying. They're all similar builds. Again, we have some compression variations. We have one of the bikes has, a little bit of head work on the 100-inch, the gasser. But what you see here is sort of interesting. We have, displacement makes more torque. Again, you heard it numerous times. There's no replacement for displacement, and this is what you see here. There's a pretty big split, as one would expect from having the increased displacement. Now, as you start moving to the far right-hand side of the graph, then what you do see is you start seeing things starting to level out a little bit. And you start seeing the horsepower starting to converge slightly, and that's really head flow, right? Because these cams are pretty good sized cams. They'll support a lot of power, but we just run out of head flow, and then therefore you see that though my bike makes less horsepower than the big bore, what it does do is it makes its peak horsepower further up. Again, that's just, when you have the same camshaft, you have the same exhaust, and you have the same head flow, what you see is normally the smaller engine will make its horsepower out further and normally a little bit less. Now here, the difference you see when we look at the 100 cubic inch is that has a little bit of head work. So I got a little extra head flow in there, and I can turn a little bit more RPM. Now I will tell you, I've been looking at this when you look at the 100-inch engine, that drop off after peak horsepower, I've got to believe I've got some lifter or spring control or something, because it shouldn't taper off that fast past peak horsepower. Maybe it's a timing thing because I don't have a lot of control inside of the ECM to make timing changes. So there's something going on there with the 100-inch that causes it to sort of nose over like that. But with all that being said, displacement makes a lot of torque, and because we're limited on head flow, the bikes all make similar peak horsepower in a given, within their given RPM range. Okay, let's move on. Since the buzzword these days is follow the science. So here's the math, and when we talk about math, this is just really comparing these 3 bikes that we put on the dyno that are similar builds. This is not a comparison between other 100, 106, one big bore builds, okay? But okay, so here's some of the math. The 100-inch is 94% the displacement of a 106. The 106 is 91.5% displacement of a 116, 117 build. The 100-inch is only 86% of the displacement of the 116 or 117. The 106 produces 4% more torque than a 100 does. The 116, 117 produces 6% more torque than my 106 does. And it also produces 11% more peak torque than the 100, my 100 cubic inch. Now we look at efficiencies. And then as we're going to see here, when you have more rotating, what's a longer stroke, or you have a larger bore, that's more surface area that causes friction, and friction reduces efficiency. So when we look at the our horsepower to cubic inch ratios, the 100 makes 1.24 horsepower per cubic inch. The 106, the 100 also makes 1.2 the 100 also makes 1.2 foot-pounds of torque per cubic inch. The 106 is now down to 1.8 foot-pounds per cubic inch, down to 1.3 horsepower cubic inch. Again, we're talking about frictions, we're talking about efficiencies, we're talking about those things that all tax our engines while we're making power. Then obviously when you get the long stroke and the big bore of the 116, 117, it's down to 1.14 foot-pounds of torque per cubic inch and makes 1.05 horsepower per cubic inch. So again, there's no displacement for cubic inches, no replacement for displacement, as they say. But this is common in any hot rod world. Bigger engines make more power, but they're also less efficient in that, because of there are other factors that take into account. So anyways, let's recap this thing. Well, there you have it. Pretty cool. And there, I think there'll be, if I was to speculate, based off when we look at social media, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about, hey, people ask a question about whatever it is when it regards to a bagger, and then if you talk about performance, normally someone will say, well, why don't you just get a crotch rocket or something else? Baggers are for cruising. But with that said, all the rage is now is baggers, right? Whether it's bagger drag racing, king of baggers, there are people that want to make a lot of power with the bagger, and so what do? We want more power. And so for those that would say, well, see, this just goes to show is that there's no real valid reason to run a big bore. They all make the same horsepower, and that's not true. First of all, the two bikes we compared the big bore to were my personal bikes that, again, have the benefit of hours and hours, days of dyno time, and testing, experimenting to get the most power I can out of them. But the other thing is too, so that's not a fair comparison. If I would just take that 116 or 117 and put it against a bike with stock, with just cams or something else. So, but when you build them similarly, this is what you get, right? These are when they're built using similar parts. And a lot of times when we go to big bores, we'll do a cam change when we do the big bore or things like that. So this is when you get them all pretty close. Now, with that being said, though, displacement is where that torque is. And so though maybe the bikes are very similar in peak horsepower in this example, what is different is the torque where we all ride our bikes. And that's at 3,000 to 45, 5,000 RPM range. And those, man, that big bore 106, or what I mean by that is the big bore 116, 117, man, it makes a lot of torque. And I rode that bike and my bike back to back. And it is a world of difference. That 7 or 8 foot-pounds of torque that bike makes more than mine does, you can feel it. And especially when you look at this, probably 10 foot-pounds of torque at 2,500 difference. And so you can definitely feel it. So yeah, pretty cool. Let me know what you think. I'm digging it. Hopefully you guys are digging it. All right, later.